Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our November 3rd Tuesday at 3 webcast. Today's topic is 4 cornerstones for cloud security. My name is Alan Falcon. I'm the CEO here at Cumulus Global, and I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy day or week to join us, either here in the live session or if you're watching this as a recorded session on demand. A couple of reminders before we get into the heart of the session here today, that all of the audio lines are muted. So if at any point in time you have a question or a comment along the top or right-hand side of your screen, you've got a couple of icons here with our GoToWebinar system. One of them opens the questions window. This allows me, notifies me that there's a question and allows me to track to make sure we've got them all answered. And at the, whether I answer them in line or we have plenty of time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. As with all our webcasts, the session's being recorded, and generally we're able to post it within 24 hours. You'll get a link to it. Feel free to share it with any of your colleagues who you think might find this information useful. Our webcasts, this webcast series, as well as our Coffee and Clouds webcast series, are only some of the resources we have available on our website, including our blog and our resource library. So please feel free to stop by cumulusglobal.com and check those out. So as we get into our topic here today, we talk about the 4 cornerstones of cloud security. This really came about because we were receiving an increasing number of requests from our existing customers and even prospective customers to fill out checklists to verify their security profile. And oftentimes, some of the things that we have control over and some of the things that we're not directly involved with, and oftentimes involve them thinking about their policies and procedures. And so we thought it would be a good idea to sort of step back and say, hey, here are 4 cornerstones. If you understand these and you put them in place, you leverage our CPR model, and I'll talk about that in a second, we can get you in a good spot and really balance the amount of technology you have around security, your policies and procedures, in a way that within your budget, you can provide the level of security and privacy that you need to protect your business, your people, your data, your applications, your customers, up and down the line. So, why is there this need? We talk about it every time we talk about security. I feel like a little bit of a broken record here, right? But we know that over the last 2 years, cyber attacks are growing at an annual rate of over 400%. Currently, the average cost of a cyber attack to a small mid-sized business is about $108,000, and that's cost of recovery, cost of any ransom that might be paid, as well as lost revenue due to downtime or due to reduced productivity while you're trying to run your business at the same time you're trying to recover. We also know statistically that if there's a successful attack that sort of knocks you offline for more than a few days, you only have a little bit less than a 50% chance of surviving the next 6 months. That type of disruption and attack can be fatal, particularly to small and mid-sized businesses. So at the same time we have this increasing threat, we're seeing an increasing number of industry standards and legal regulatory requirements coming at us. And so, and most recently now, cybersecurity is a key factor in business reputation. Not just in a business to consumer relationship, but in a business to business, and that your customers want to trust that their information is private, that you're secure, and that, excuse me, that they're well protected. So we talk about cybersecurity and protecting your business. We're really talking not just about passwords or spam protection or endpoint protection. We're really talking about a collection of 3 types of things: policies and procedures, technologies, and services, right? So, you really start at the top saying, how do we want to secure our business? How do we need to protect the business? Put those policies and procedures in place. And then you can deploy technologies and services to implement those. And sure enough, there are times where the technology or the service you provide may not work the way your policies and procedures dictate, at which point you're either finding another solution or maybe you're editing your policies and procedures to reflect how the security and how your protection actually works. And what we're really looking to protect when we talk about protecting your business isn't just the technology, like, I want to protect my computers from getting hacked. It's really about protecting your data, which is the lifeline of our businesses, as well as your people. And that includes their identity, and their role with it, personally as well as their role within the company. So it all comes into play, and it really is, we look at cybersecurity as a holistic, entity and a holistic enterprise, really, when we look at how that fits in with our business, our business customers. So now our model around cybersecurity, we've got a number of blog posts and there are other webcasts that talk about this in more detail, is aptly named CPR, and really three components. First is communicate and educate. The second is prevent and protect, and the third is respond and recover. And as the names, as the names sort of dictate or imply, when we talk about communicate and educate, it's really making sure that you and your team are aware of the risks, are aware of behaviors that enhance security, as well as behaviors that put security and data privacy at risk. And this is really also the umbrella under which your policies and procedures come into play. Now, particularly if you're in a regulated industry that has either regulatory or industry standards around privacy, typically what you'll find is that there are a set of rules you have to adhere to. And one of those will involve education and training of your staff. But it's not just enough to have the rules and say you adhere to the rules. You also need a mechanism to be able to understand if the rules are being followed and that you can mitigate any risk should there be a breach in protocol, or even a data breach itself. And so that communication and education really encompasses not only making sure your people are aware and in tune and understand good behavior versus bad, how to avoid security accidents, what not to do, but that you have policies and procedures in place that document how your cybersecurity works, how you monitor it so you understand that it's working, how you would catch an incident, and what you would do in response. So how you catch those incidents really comes into two ways, right? Ideally, we want to prevent, and that means putting in procedures, putting in technologies that block risks and minimize and mitigate risks. And you also want to protect, which means once you've got data, you want to keep it, once you have data, you want to keep it private. You want to keep it from escaping. You don't want it to be breached. You don't want it to be leaked. You don't want accidental disclosure. You don't want malicious actions to cause something. And then, you can have all the policies and procedures and all the user training and all the technology you want. Nothing's perfect. So if and when something happens, that's where the R comes in. That's respond and recover. And in most organizations, and this is sort of an area lacking in the world of service providers, will focus on the recover. How do we get your data back? How do we get your business up and running? And that's critically important. Don't get me wrong, but equally important is how you respond. And that is, how do you communicate with your customers? How do you communicate with your staff? How do you address public communications or regulatory filings and legal requirements? If you're a business that sells to consumers, your response may include credit monitoring and protection, depending on the nature of the breach. There's a whole range of aspects of responding to a cybersecurity attack or incident above and beyond just recovering your data and recovering your business and getting yourself up and running. And they're both equally important because they can both have existential threats. Both pose an existential threat to your business. You want to address them both. So now let's talk about cornerstones and the four of them. And let's start number one. The first cornerstone is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And this is really about, and this cornerstone is the key to ensuring your business continuity and resilience, right? This is where we're saying we know how we protect the information we have. We know how to make sure the information's accurate, that there's integrity, it hasn't been corrupted, and that it stays or is easily available to us should something happen. And so what scope of information? It's everything. Whether you create it, receive it from someone else, transmit it or share it with someone else, or simply maintain it in your systems, it needs to be appropriately confidential. You need to ensure it's not tampered with, and that the data you have is the data you're supposed to have, and it's not been corrupted in any way. And you need to make sure that it's available to you, your team, is needed to run the business, and is appropriate to your vendors, your customers, etc. And so when we talk about building out the cornerstone of confidentiality, integrity, or availability, or CIA for short, we're really talking about establishing your basic security infrastructure. And this is really what protects you against attacks. It's going to prevent those breaches across IT systems, and it's going to give you the ability to respond to issues and recover. Again, you see the elements here of CPR already coming into play. And so if we look at those elements and how they all come together, we'll start looking, and we're going to sort of go out of order here, just ease of viewing on the screen here. When we talk about confidentiality, integrity, and availability, we do start with communicate and educate again. And here's where end user training comes into play, making sure that they understand how to use the systems, how to maintain security, what are those user best practices that they need to have in place. But it also, as I mentioned earlier, starts with those policies and procedures. And there's 3 policies and procedures that we recommend everyone have in place. Non-disclosure and confidentiality should be part of any, should be presented to people whenever they're hired. An understanding of what information in your company is confidential and should not be disclosed, what's allowable disclosure, and the penalties for intentional or accidental disclosure. And a modern non-disclosure and confidentiality policy will also talk about the employee's responsibility to not just react, but proactively or actively act in ways that prevent or mitigate the risk of a data breach or data loss. And an understanding that they have a role to play and that they have responsibilities when it comes to keeping the business and the information secure. The second policy is, generally, and a lot of companies overlook this, is an appropriate use policy, which is how are you allowed to use company resources and equipment for doing your job, what's allowed, what's not, and either within that policy or as a separate policy, you need that bring your own device or use of personal devices policy. And whether it's a BYOD policy or it's a use of personal devices, again, it's setting the ground rules. And this is where you get into issues of how do you separate the company's data and the individual's data? How do you make sure that if someone is using and working from their personal computer at home, that the company knows that that machine is properly protected from malware and desktop attacks and viruses and things of that nature? If someone's using their phone for work, how do you know that if that phone is lost or stolen, that the business can delete the business's data, right? And that, again, there's that segregation between, church and state, if you will, between the personal and the business environment. And so having policies and procedures in place, or whether you have a BYOD policy or you're simply acknowledging the fact that at times your employees are going to use their own cell phone or their own smartphone, their own laptop or their desktop computer at home, what do you want to have in place? And oftentimes when we get into building out these policies, there's some give and take, right? So, you'd like to work from home 2 days a week. That's great. We can let you do that. Oh, you already have a computer. Wonderful. We can have you use it and not, and we don't need to provide another one, which takes up a lot of room in your house, but we need to be able to install our, virus protection software on it and manage it. And just know that should you leave the company, we're going to remove that and then you'd be on yourself. Or, since you're working from home and the nature of your job means you need some of that data locally, we're going to set up a backup system for that device to make sure any data that's local to your machine is protected and that machine is protected. So often there's some give and take as far as putting in place the security protections that the company needs with the for the convenience or the ability of people to work mobile or work remote. It can be more challenging if you have existing employers. How you deal with contractors is another layer of complexity there. But again, you want to make sure that, since we're not bound by the 4 walls of our office, we're not sitting behind that physical firewall anymore, that anyone who's touching information that the company deems its property, and particularly if it's information that needs to be kept private, confidential, that however people are accessing it from whatever device is owned by whomever, that the data is properly protected and secured. So with CIA on the response and recovery side, Again, here it's backup and recovery. And when we think of backup recovery, too often we think of servers and workstations. We need to back up and be able to recover what's in the cloud. So with Google Workspace and Microsoft 365, both vendors have a shared responsibility model. Their responsibility is to keep the service up and running and to keep it accessible to you and to provide the mechanisms by which you can protect your data. Since they don't understand what protection your data needs and who should see it and who should not, once your data is in their cloud, whether it's Google or Microsoft, it's your responsibility to keep it secure. I mean, it's your responsibility to set the permissions, to control access, to set the rules about external sharing, to decide what is applicable data transmit and what is considered a leak or a breach, and build your environment around it. They're also saying that you need to protect it, that they do back up and recover the system so they can restore the system. You need to back up and recover your data so that your data is available and usable to you. At a different tier in response and recovery are the features that come with archive and e-discovery and the ability to pull back and search for files, emails, chats. And we recommend that that even small businesses, even solopreneurs, should really configure their IT environment to support and really use a mindset of business continuity. We also talk about resiliency, right? We offer, for example, for people who work on laptops and they might need to be disconnected from the internet so they have local data or they're caching data down to the laptops, we have two types of protection for those laptops that we offer. One is backup and recovery. You delete a file, you overwrite a file, excellent. We can go to the backup, we can recover that file. The other gives you that backup and recovery, but it's also, hey, if your hard drive crashes or you drop your laptop and it doesn't boot up, we have an image snapshot of that laptop that was taken recently that we can boot up for you in a cloud. Or if you can get to any device with a browser, we can have you up and running in under 30 minutes, right? So one level of service is that backup recovery. The other is the business continuity, the disaster recovery. How resilient are you? How easily would you be able to keep your environment running in the face of disasters, big, hurricanes, ice storms, or small, broken laptops, stolen devices, hard disk crash on a workstation or a server. And that all comes into play really about the availability. Not everyone needs, I'll step back to archive and discovery. Not everybody needs archive and discovery. Quite often, the use of archive and e-discovery is driven by industry requirements or regulatory requirements. HIPAA, PCI, Security Exchange Commission, Section 17, 1 through 4, all of those types of solutions warrant an archive and e-discovery solution component in order to comply with those industry and regulatory requirements. We are seeing that more businesses, even small and mid-sized businesses, given the minimal incremental cost, see archive e-discovery as a way to monitor and manage employment policies, to be able to deal with customer service quality issues, or internal communications or even external communications that might be abusive or harassing or in violation of company policy. It also gives you another opportunity, should you have a data leak, to investigate whether that leak was incidental, accidental, due to negligence, or was intentional. Because that, depending on how the leak happened, the archive and e-discovery mechanism could provide that service could provide the mechanism by which the data left the company. And so it all comes into play. Similarly, across confidential integrity and availability is what falls into that protect and prevent classification. And here, when you talk about confidentiality, encryption, both at rest and in motion, is important. For both confidentiality and availability, identity management and protection. Multi-factor authentication is a minimum expectation. Identity access and management solutions, if your needs are more complex, provide a more sophisticated mechanism for controlling access. and managing permissions. And so, it gives you more ability to be more refined and more managed in internal permissions, who has access to what, how, what are the different levels of confidentiality, and who has access to what as far as availability goes. Integrity also impacted by all of these things, right? With fewer people accessing, you're less likely to have data corruption due to accident or negligence. Another aspect of data integrity when it comes to identity management and protection is also just managing yourselves at the domain level, right? And so specifically with email, the sender policy framework, SPF records are critically important. They provide a base level validation when people receive email that it's coming from an IP address that is allowed to send mail on your behalf. Now, since IP addresses are able to be spoofed, in many cases, you then have the DKIM standard, which is a step up, which says, hey, at a certain point in time, this message is encrypted with a key. There's a public key to decrypt it, and you can verify that whatever was encrypted under DKIM at that point has not been tampered with. So it helps ensure integrity. Now, this doesn't stop all ability to phish or to spoof or to do business email compromise. To get really far down that road, you're looking at DMARC, which starts with SPF and DKIM and adds the ability to dictate and let people know who receive your email messages what to do if a message is suspicious. And that reporting back feeds the process to make your email more deliverable. And so it's where DMARC comes in, where it gets very difficult for people to spoof identities of people, to have emails within your company look like it's coming from within, etc. And so having all three layers there is an important factor. We also see, with respect to CIA under Protect and Prevent, device management and protection. And this should be no surprise, right? We need to secure your network infrastructure. Passwords, wireless SSIDs and passwords at an appropriate level. Your infrastructure devices, access points, switches, routers, firewalls should be secure. Traffic should be encrypted at the local level. When it comes to our endpoints, our servers, our workstations, even IoT devices, they should have advanced endpoint protection. Not just, hey, does this file have the signature of a virus in it, but monitoring how things behave and the ability to roll back an individual file or action should it become suspicious. Additionally, mobile device management. And when we talk about mobile device management, most people think about smartphones. When we talk about mobile device management, we're talking about pretty much every device. Segregation of personal and company information. The ability to manage access to the device, the ability to disable the device or remotely wipe data, the ability to monitor utilization. All of these things come into mobile device, and just as those work wonders and help you protect your iPhone or your Android device, it can help you protect your laptops and even the desktops that aren't really mobile at all. Having that capability gives you a lot of power and the ability to ensure that confidentiality and integrity of the data, and make sure that if there's an equipment loss or a physical breach, that you have the ability to mitigate or prevent it. With data protection, we talk a lot about advanced threat protection. Oftentimes this goes with email, doing things like sandboxing and link verification and all these other cool things. But there's advanced threat protection for your files and your systems as well, right? Looking at behaviors, looking for advanced persistent threats that might be on the machine, monitoring, watching what happens on your network to explore before it launches itself. And then and that's sort of what comes from the outside in. Looking at what happens on the inside, leaving its data loss protection. Are permissions managed? Do we know it's being shared outside the company to individuals or publicly by accident or by design? Do we know what's going outbound in email messages and what's happening when documents are being shared? And there are tools that can they can look at your business rules for what can be shared at when, and can monitor and mitigate the risk and even prevent or remove permissions if need be to prevent data loss through the different channels that data can leave your company. On top of that, DNS protection, verifying who you are, preventing denial of service attacks, and web filtering and protection, knowing that right now about 1 in 5 cyber attacks is due to code that's embedded in websites, most of them are websites we trust that have been corrupted, usually through third-party content, right? So you go to a trusted website, some third-party content has a video that audio plays. As that autoplay starts, it's actually downloading code to your machine. And we want to make sure that doesn't happen as well. So that web filtering and protection all comes into play. Okay, and that's really a lot to digest, but those are the sort of the components of that first pillar. And some will argue that the first pillar is the biggest pillar. I'm not sure that's the case, but let's look at number 2 and we'll move on from there. So number 2 is external threat protection. We define this as identify, protect against reasonably anticipated threats. And again, these are threats from the outside. And so things like phishing and ransomware, business email compromise, DNS attacks, advanced persistent threats. I've mentioned all of these up till now in different contexts, but we want to focus on those. And again, we're not just saying, hey, protect the data, protect the email. It's protecting, it's not just a file or email, it's all of your data, your applications, your system, and your people. And all of that comes into play. And so you want to be aware of that and really think about how we're looking, what's coming from the outside coming in. So again, here, user training as far as awareness, testing to make sure, the joke is among IT professionals that every company has one person who will click on every single link no matter what, right? So assuming that, make sure they're aware, send the test emails, see what they click on, go back to those users, provide additional training and reinforcement of good behavior versus dangerous behavior. And again, having those policies and procedures in place, particularly appropriate use and the use of personal devices or BYOD comes into play in minimizing. We see more external threats making it to companies right now through personal devices being used with the business than we do on company-owned assets. On the other end of the spectrum, response and recovery, all 3 of the methods we talked about earlier come into play here with external, right? Because of external threats, you need to have your backup recovery in place. You want your archive in e-discovery because that's part of the mechanism by which you ensure data integrity. And you want to have business continuity and DR. So should something happen, your business isn't existentially threatened. You're able to keep up and running and working efficiently. And so protect and prevent, yes, everything that is relevant for maintaining your confidentiality, integrity, and availability pretty much relates to how you prevent and protect against external threats. A new item we add to this list here is dark web monitoring and response, right? And this is where we look at the fact that more than 70% of humans will use the same or similar passwords or passwords that follow a identifiable pattern across multiple systems. And so the challenge we run into as business owners is we have people logging into other services using our business email, right? So if that service, say Shopify or LinkedIn, has a data breach and usernames and passwords are compromised, the first thing the hackers do are going to try that username password combination with Microsoft 365, with Google Workspace, with Dropbox, with, just name it, all these other services out there, and see where that compromised identity can get them. So dark web monitoring lets us see, whose identity is showing up as having been disclosed, or partially or fully compromised. And it's out there on the dark web. And it really comes in 2 flavors. There's that direct threat. Ooh, someone hacked one of my systems, or someone hacked a system and there was a breach in a system where my username is the same or my password is the same or similar or guessable through a pattern. But there's also the indirect threats that come into play, such as, this service was breached and they now have my first name, my last name, email address, and my 3 security questions for that bank or for that service. And those service questions are similar to ones and others, so that could let someone pretend to be me and potentially reset a password and gain access to my account someplace else. So monitoring your domain on the dark web and responding and following up, making sure that people are changing their passwords frequently enough, for example, that they understand that some of their personal information might be out there, and that phishing attacks can be more directed with that information that's out there, can help further minimize the threats and protect you and prevent those attacks from happening and from being successful. Number 3, our third cornerstone, is internal threat protection. We looked at the outside. Now let's look what happens on the inside. And here, so we're identifying and protecting against reasonably anticipated uses and disclosures, right? And really, the Venn diagram sort of covers it, right? Most data breaches are accidental. There's no conscious decision to act inappropriately. There's no motive to do harm, right? At the other end of the spectrum, there are times where the ticked off employee decides to do something bad and decides to do harm. In the middle is where we also have to be careful, and that's negligent. Where, well, there's no motive to do harm, there's no conscious decision to act inappropriately, but there's no conscious decision to act properly, right? The care isn't being taken. It's not being paid attention. So there's no motive to do harm, but there's also not enough motive to prevent harm from happening for people to act appropriately. And that's where the negligence comes in. And that can be the hardest of the 3 to deal with sometimes. So we want to prevent breaches and losses. And where do these come from? Yeah, they come from individual user actions. They can also come from application errors and configuration issues. And you have to look across the whole spectrum to say, hey, by default, when we set up, a new shared drive or a new SharePoint site, by default, are we excluding public access? Right? Do we have rules set up that says if information is confidential, how do we restrict it as we add a project to our file system or our application, as we, bring on a new employee? All of these processes come into play. And when we look at user action, whether it's malicious, negligent, or accidental, we see them falling into, 2 general areas: permission errors and inappropriate sharing, right? So permissions errors are, this is a document that, the sales team needs and the service team needs, but when I share it, I'm going to inadvertently or intentionally share it with the whole company, right? The scariest examples are obviously employee records or payroll records or company financial systems, where we're all worried, we don't want everyone in the company have access to that. Of course you don't. But individual users can make permission errors by including people who shouldn't have access, or providing people with write access, the ability to edit, when they should only have view access. And so there's 2 levels there. Inappropriate sharing isn't about setting permissions, because again, permissions can be set by a user, they can be set by an administrator, or they can be built into an application or a system. And those can be static and set up wrong, or they can be dynamic where they're set as things happen. Inappropriate sharing is, I send an email outside the company, I attach the wrong file. Or I send an email with an attachment to a customer, and there's information that cut in that file that should not be shared with the customer, or that particular file is for internal use only. So inappropriate sharing is where there's an explicit effort to share something, and it's just shared with people who shouldn't have access, right? And so it's an active error as opposed to a potentially passive error. But again, you want to catch that information before it gets out the door, right? And really understanding on what's malicious, negligent, or accidental really comes on the level of intent of what was done, right? So we have companies we work with who try and keep their security infrastructure as simple as possible. We don't argue with that. But then you have to look and say, okay, what's the intent here, and what's the potential unintended consequence? Similarly, for individual users, did they share it appropriately on purpose? Were they not thinking, or are they just not aware? right? And comes into play, and how you respond and how you deal with that employee will be impacted by your belief on their level of intent. So again, here, user training is important. Those policies and procedures need to be in place, and should something happen, your response and recovery mechanisms need to be in place. And again, here with internal threat protection, we emphasize not only what, when I went to detail with confidentiality, integrity, and availability, but similar to the external threat protection, dark web monitoring, we see having value with internal threat protection as well. And it's something that many companies don't have in place. Why? Because through dark web breaches, phishing attacks can become more prevalent. It's easier to compromise people's identity and give outsiders access to internal systems and change those permissions. But generally, we feel for internal threat protection, there's a higher level of training that needs to be in place in education, so that people understand the policies and procedures about who does what, how, and when, and how their actions can help or hurt the effort to manage data, information privacy, people's privacy, and the confidentiality of information that goes around. On that note, we're going to move into cornerstone number 4, and that's compliance. And really, this is making sure that the business is compliant and the workforce is compliant, which begs the question, compliant with what? And there's 4 levels of compliance, right? There's legal compliance. You don't do this, you're guilty of a crime, you go to jail. There's regulatory compliance. If you don't do this, you're in violation of regulations that were established by law. You may not go to jail, you may get fined, you may lose your license. There are a number of things. Then there's industry compliance. So for example, PCI, rules and regulations around data privacy, is a compliance mechanism that's agreed upon by anyone who participates in the credit card and debit card processing industry. If the industry association put the rules together in order to join the exchanges so that you can connect and actually settle your credit card transactions, you have to agree to the industry standards for data protection, right? And the 4th level, which is not listed here on the slide, is policy, right? What are the rules of your business, right? Whether it's how you operate, how you engage with customers and vendors, how you avoid conflicts of interest, policies around internal communications, harassment, any employment policy you might have, or any policy on how you conduct your business comes into play. You want to make sure you're in compliance. And the process for that in compliance has 3 components. It's the policies and the procedures that says, what do we need to comply with and how are we going to do it? And part of the how is how we will use certain technologies to help us do it. There's the monitoring and the enforcement, which involves technology here as well. How do we know if people are following the policy? How do we know that they're executing the procedures the way they're supposed to be and doing the rule and following the rules? And what do we do if it doesn't happen, or how can we enforce it to make sure it only happens that way? And technology can play a critical role and huge role there, and not necessarily great expense. And the third leg on the tri-legged stool is the mitigation response. Well, what happens if we discover that procedures aren't being followed, that policies are being violated, that we're out of compliance in any way, and what's our response? So how do we respond? How do we mitigate the damage? And that all comes into play in compliance. And again, from our CPR model, there is user training. If you here to the typical user training we've talked about, industry best practices come into play, right? How do other businesses like ours do this, and how do they protect it, right? And response and recover with compliance, archive and discovery is probably the most important service to have in place if it's necessary, as well as that business continuity and DR, which includes the backup and recovery function. And again, particularly if you have compliance issues, your policies and procedures are part of any audit, right? So sometimes it's not what you do as much as, are you doing what you're saying you're doing? So you can have a policy, for example, in the financial sector, everyone says, oh, you need to keep records for 7 years. In some cases, that's true. In most cases, you need to keep records for however long you say by policy you're keeping the records. If you say there's certain records we'll maintain for 7 years, and there are other records we'll only maintain for 3, so long as you can demonstrate that you're maintaining the appropriate records for the appropriate durations, and you're not, retaining information indefinitely, right? There's a negative enforcement side of the, a negative reinforcement of the policy as well. Then you're in good shape, right? So the training on the policies and procedures, having them in place to meet the requirements you hit, the compliance requirements you have, in a way that you can say, hey, we've got these in place, we validate and monitor to make sure they're followed, and we know what we're going to do and how we're going to respond if they're not. So on protection and prevention, all 5 categories come into play: encryption, identity management protection, data protection. We talk about assessments are really important. Most of the times, if you have a compliance requirement, you will be asked to complete yourself, or you'll have to have a third party come in and do an assessment about your level of compliance, and that gets reported back to the compliance agency or internally if it's internal policy and procedures. And again, this is often driven by published legal and or industry-specific regulations. So how you need to comply is usually pretty well defined, and every industry will have best practices they've developed to meet those compliance requirements. Understanding those makes the path to compliance and maintaining compliance much easier. The challenge comes for many small businesses is, how do we map those requirements to your business? Does everything need a technology associated with to be compliant? No, but the policies and procedures need to match how the technology is implemented and what manual processes or other processes you might have in place to support, enforce, and monitor adherence to those policies, right? And so there's a scale that's involved. So a lot of small businesses we run into maybe not compliant at all with their industry requirements or regulatory requirements, in part because they're afraid that to become compliant is too expensive. And our response is that they're probably overthinking what they need. Given the size of your business, the scope, let's map those requirements to your business, understand what's necessary, what's preferred, and there are always multiple ways to achieve compliance. Let's look at that. And the goal would be, obviously, that if you're assessed, you pass, and that the reporting back is positive. Okay. So what does the roadmap look like? If you're saying, man, where do I start? Start with understanding, right? Understand your external requirements, whether it's legal, regulatory, or industry, and your internal requirements from a business policy and practice standpoint. Document and assess those using our 4 cornerstones and our CPR model, right? And really that comes down to completing what we call a security footprint matrix. And we have a quick guide available on our website. We've got a blog post about this security footprint that you can link to and see this, that sort of says, hey, in these, our 4 cornerstones are across the top, and components of CPR, major components of CPR are down the left-hand side. If you're worried about one of the, the foundation, foundational cornerstones, look down the column. It'll tell you which technologies you may need. It's not definitive, it's a guide. And again, that mapping and that customization is important. As you do that, you'll obviously identify what you have, which will let you see what gaps may exist, and you can prioritize those. Once you have gaps you want to fill or need to fill prioritized, then you can plan solutions and you can phase that in. And that might be updating policies and procedures or technologies or training. It could be adding new, or it can be replacing. It all depends on what's needed. The key is, as you plan your phases, you need to communicate with your team what we're doing and why, how it impacts their daily work, how it's going to help the company, where's the benefit for the effort that they're going to put in to adapt to or participate in the change, and have that education again around the overall risk and the responsibilities that each of us have to keep sensitive information private, protected, and keep our businesses secure and protected. And so it's a high-level roadmap. So what are your action items? Well, I always say your action is to call us because we can help you through this. Let's assess your risks and opportunities. Where are you with your security? What's there? What's needed? Go through that roadmap we just talked about. With a scope in mind, define the value proposition. What money do you want to spend or do you need to spend? What are the benefits of moving forward, and what's the impact of inaction? And here with security, the impact of inaction might be, oh, there's no impact unless we have a breach. And if we have a breach, the impact would be mild, or maybe it'll be catastrophic. Maybe we don't see the benefit of investing a little bit more in some security features because our risk of a breach is exceedingly low. Just as long as you understand that if that breach happens in certain states, you might be automatically responsible for triple damages because you made a decision not to implement or you weren't compliant. And so the value proposition has the positive view as well as the negative consequence view. You have to assess both sides of the coin to get that full value proposition. And that'll help you decide what to do, where to spend your money, in what order and how much. That lets you plan strategically, as we said, phase tactical changes, and then execute. We can certainly contact us because we can certainly help you through that whole process. So at this point, I'm going to open it up. I haven't had any questions throughout the session here, so I'm going to open it up for folks. So please open that questions window and ask away. Additionally, into the session here, and for those watching this on recording, you can always contact us. info@cumulusglobal.com. Our toll-free and standard numbers are on the screen as well. If you want to reach out to me directly, I don't have an assistant or anything, so Falcon@cumulusglobal.com comes to my inbox. My direct line is there as well. Again, I don't have anyone who answers my phone. So I will tell you I'm horrible at answering the phone. I'm even worse at responding to voicemail. The best way to reach me is by email. I will get back to you by email. So that's a great way. So at this point, what I'm going to do is for those watching on demand, I'm going to wrap up the recording. And so I'll thank you for taking time to watch the recording. And then I'll reconvene with those here live to answer any questions they might have.